In what sense, if any, are you the same person you were as a child? Or in what sense are you a different person? How did you become the you that you currently are, or develop into the current you? How much do you resemble your parents? Or how much resemblance was there when you were a child, and has that changed as you've grown older? What in you, if anything, is permanent, and what is changing throughout your life? What sorts of changes do people go through in their childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, even old age? What exactly causes these changes? Is development consistently gradual, or are there discontinuities, jumps from one stage to the next? What important experiences are typical at different stages of life? Are there differences in these important experiences between different cultures? How much of the changes are due to biological factors like genetics, and how much difference does the social environment make? How universal are the changes, and how much individual variation is there? Some of these questions may sound rather philosophical, but they are all studied within developmental psychology. It might be a good idea to stop for a moment to think about those questions. At different stages of your life, you may have different answers of your own to at least some of them. I would like to see what answers you can give, so please post one or more in the comments below. In the meantime, I'll introduce myself. Hi, my name is Jouni Vilkka, and this is my channel, TFF Teacher from Finland. Don't forget to subscribe and click the thumbs up button. In this video, I will go over some initial things about this series, like the contents of the whole course, and some basic concepts of developmental psychology. These include lifespan, types of development, risk and protective factors, critical and sensitive period, and environmental factors. I will also discuss the field briefly and end with some thoughts on relevant ethical issues. This is a popular introduction to developmental psychology. It is popular in the sense that it is not too technical or complicated, and no prior knowledge of the subject is required or expected of the viewer. This means that I will not be discussing psychological research in great detail, nor will I include proper citations. I will mention several researchers by name and important studies by how they are usually referred to, so that anyone interested can easily look up more information on their own. Despite being a course, there are no exams, no homework, and no diploma or study credits to be gained here. Instead, what I hope to provide is an easy to understand explanation of the very basics of psychological development. This course covers human development throughout the whole lifespan. In this, it differs slightly from the current curriculum for Finnish senior high schools, where adolescence has been emphasized at the expense of adulthood. University-level introductory courses do include the whole lifespan until death, and I prefer to do the same here, even if I generally keep the level of complexity and detail lower. It may also seem odd that I do not discuss learning that much within this course, even though it is strongly related to development. That is because it was one of the main issues in my previous YouTube course and book, Introduction to Psychology. Also, issues about mental health related to development I will leave for the course on mental health that will follow, so I will not discuss them here. This series consists of an overview of the subject, this video, followed by two sections consisting of several videos each. where human psychological development is discussed in more detail. In the first of those, the next set of videos, development is approached one aspect at a time, so that physical development, for example, is discussed separately from emotional development. In the last section, development is approached one stage of life at a time, so that various kinds of development during childhood, say, are discussed separately from other stages of life. I am aware that this rather unusual way of including both approaches in the same series will cause some redundancy or repetition, but some repetition is also just good for learning. Although I will not be citing sources during this course, I will provide a list of the sources I used here. Most of them are in Finnish, I'm afraid. If you want to read a slightly higher level and broader book on development than my book and this series, I recommend Lifespan Development, published by OpenStax, listed above. It is clearly broader and deeper than the present series, but readable without prior knowledge on the subject. Lifespan refers to a person's whole life, from the cradle to the grave, as they say. In fact, developmental psychologists are already interested in prenatal development because the conditions in which the fetus develops are important for the rest of its life. Once a person has died, their influence on others will linger for a time, and they will probably be mourned. These are also matters of some interest to developmental psychologists. Lifespan is seen somewhat differently in different cultures. In Western cultures, it is usually thought of as an arc with a high point in the middle. I have asked my students to draw their own lifespans, as they expect them to turn out, and often the result is some version of such an arc. I recommend that you also try this exercise, and not just this once, but at different points during your life, because it may enable you to see your current situation in the wider context of your whole life, and make you focus on what is important. You don't necessarily need to actually draw or write it on paper, but if you do, that may prove beneficial. You can set goals, write them down, break them up into sub-goals with deadlines to help you actually achieve those goals. Of course, the final deadline you can only estimate based on the lifespans of your parents and other relatives, as well as your own lifestyle and choices. But trust me, no matter your age, there isn't much time left. If you want to use what time you have for something good and meaningful, you have to start doing it. Soon your time will be up. There is little point hastening it either. As you grow older, time will seem to fly by faster and faster, and if you haven't already, you will realize time is by far the most precious resource you have. Anyway, the Western way of seeing lifespan as an arc probably comes from the way we value things, such as being able to be active and powerful, to do what we want. As children, we don't have much of such power or even ability, and by old age we start to lose them, but somewhere in the middle we are at our best. Ancient Greeks, for example, thought that men are at their best at 33. Our middle-aged people tend to be older, but they typically have the most money and power in society. Middle-aged people are usually also in a very good situation considering their cognitive abilities, knowledge, emotional intelligence, and social contacts. When we draw an arc representing our lives, it is likely that it is such things we are thinking about. Yet an arc is not the only way to represent lifespan. Perhaps Asian and African people, who traditionally have valued old age more, would rather draw a rising line to show the increasing prestige and respect a person earns as they grow older. How about you? How would you represent lifespan, and do you think your way is typical in your culture? Let me know in the comments below. There have been several ways to divide lifespan, even in developmental psychology. Here are 3 common ways to do it, which I will label simply A, B, and C. The stages in A include infancy from age 0 to 2, age of play from 2 to 6, school age from 7 to 11, adolescence from 12 to 18, adulthood from 19 to 64, and old age from 65 to anything older. B includes early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. And C includes childhood, adulthood, third age, and fourth age. None of these different ways of dividing lifespan is true or false, but there may be reasons to prefer one of them or some other way to conceptualize changes in life. For example, the way A describes everyone above age 65 as old is considered offensive by some and misleading by others, because these days a lot of people live to 80 or more without suffering the kinds of problems often associated with old age. For these reasons, C includes simply a third and fourth age. Here the third age refers to the mature age, where one might already be retired from work but still active in several ways. Fourth age, then, is more associated with being old, the body and probably mind as well becoming frail, and it becomes clear that the end is getting near. But these are just definitions, and the researcher, or whoever uses such terms, simply has to define the concepts they use as usual. That choice can be important for the usefulness of the research conducted. Research in developmental psychology is usually focused on some aspect of development related to age or growth. For example, the focus can be on the development of motor skills such as walking and hand-eye coordination, a very biological approach. Or it can be focused on emotional development and approach very much on the mental level of psychology, which is also called the psychic level, but I'd rather not use the term for what I think are obvious reasons. See the video on the levels of human psychology in my introduction to psychology for an explanation of these different levels. It is also possible for the research to be focused on areas between such levels, such as psychosocial development, and in that case the approach of the researcher may be either mostly from the cognitive or mental level side or a socio-cultural one. These approaches are not mutually exclusive, as different approaches can provide a fuller understanding of the phenomenon in question than one approach alone could. Such different approaches and their findings will be discussed in a later video, in the next section. In what now follows, I will provide some examples of the general things developmental psychologists have figured out about human development. It is possible for different experiences in early life to lead to the same result. The term for this kind of developmental trajectories is equifinality. Multifinality is the opposite, where very similar experiences in different people result in different outcomes. Because they are mostly interested in undesirable outcomes, such as antisocial behavior, developmental psychologists have looked for risk factors that increase the probability of an individual developing that way. But it's not all about the bad things. They have also found protective factors that reduce this probability and negate risk factors, enabling the individual to develop well. Risk factors have different effects at different stages of life. For example, how a person reacts to one of their parents suffering from a serious illness is probably very different depending on whether the person is 2 years old or 22 years old. There are obviously individual differences in how people react. The context is very important as well, because the same factor can increase the risk in one context and decrease it in another. A single risk factor alone is not usually a major problem, but if several of them accumulate on the same individual, it is very likely that they are going to have difficulties. Some risk factors are based on the individual's own characteristics, like temperament, which might cause problems in the relationship with a parent, or their own experiences, such as stressful or even traumatic events. It might be that the environment they grow up in doesn't have good stimuli. Some urban settings might be like that, compared to places that have parks, playgrounds, good bicycle paths, and other places where children can safely play and participate in various activities. Risk factors might also have to do with the child's family. These include frequent conflicts and arguing, the parents not having time for the child, and inconsistent upbringing. This last could mean the same parent behaving inconsistently, or the parents being inconsistent with each other. The family may also break apart, creating risks, although it may be possible for mature adults to handle things well, so that their child is not adversely affected. School can also include risk factors, such as the classroom size being too big, or causing experiences of failure, lack of support, and demanding achievement level that is too high for the pupil. It may be that schools are also differently funded, which is not much of a problem in Finland, but it is, for example, in the US. This is likely to create a split between social classes, clearly a risk for those in the lower. The community the child lives in can also cause risks. Just having to move from one community to another too often is a risk. If there is no stable community, that is also a problem. The lack of commonly accepted norms is a significant risk, for example, perhaps leading to antisocial behavior. There are differences between individuals in how vulnerable they are to various risks. Some may have a hereditary vulnerability to antisocial behavior, for example, or their earlier experiences may make them vulnerable to later experiences. A Finnish study found that a specific gene, together with the lack of social support, but only then correlated with depression. Both the genetic trait and the environmental situation have to coexist for the harm to occur. Different circumstances can protect the individual from that genetic vulnerability. Risk factors and their possible effects have to be studied as processes that influence development throughout life. Risks at one stage in life, for example, can be realized as problems in the next. Different risks are also in a dynamic interaction with each other, which is why multiple risks significantly increase the probability of problems, while a single risk is unlikely to be too bad on its own. Protective factors can also depend on the context. A factor can be protective in certain contexts, but a risk in certain others. For example, social isolation can be either, depending on the context, although I guess it usually is a risk. Being adopted would be another similar example. Protective factors are thus not to be thought of as nice events, but rather any factors that, just like risk factors, function in processes that support positive development and tend to negate the effects of risk factors. There are many kinds of protective factors. They include opportunities for study and work, social support, the presence of at least one safe, caring adult, a positive relationship with one's parents, or at least one of them, child-centered upbringing, so-called easy temperament, good self-confidence, high enough level of intelligence, and so on. The Finnish study, the Jyväskylä Longitudinal Study of Personality and Social Development, JYLS, known in Finnish as lapsesta aikuiseksi tutkimus, literally from child to adult study, is a very long study that follows the development of close to 400 individuals from childhood to adulthood. It began in 1959 when the subjects were 8 years old and still continues. See the link below for more information on that study. That study has found that pro-social behavior and child-centered, as opposed to adult-centered, upbringing are some of the protective factors against the circle of failure that includes risks or outcomes such as maladjustment to school, lack of occupational opportunities, and long-term unemployment. Resilience means the ability to adjust and adapt, not give up, to resist stress and successfully handle difficult situations. It very much depends on context, and a person who has resilience at one point in life might not have it in the next. Generally speaking, people can learn at any age, as can dogs, so the saying about old dogs and learning is false. That said, age does matter for learning, especially in two hugely important ways, and this is where the concept of critical period and sensitive period come in. A critical period refers to a phase in development by the end of which a specific skill has to be learned, or it will never be learned, at least not properly. For example, we simply have to learn some kind of language during the first 5 years of our lives, or we will never really learn any language. So-called wolf children are an unfortunate example of children missing the critical period in learning a language. The term refers to children cared for by non-human animals in the wild. One of the origin stories of the city of Rome includes the twins Romulus and Remus, who were raised by wolves and later found the city. While there is probably no truth to that story, it shows that even ancient Romans knew about the wolf child phenomenon. There have been several cases, even in the modern era, where wolves or primates have apparently found children helpless in the wild for some reason and sort of adopted them. Later, the children were found by other humans and brought to civilization, much like in the story of Tarzan. Unfortunately, if the children had missed the critical period, they never learned to speak a proper human language. Instead, they might continue to behave more or less like wild animals, barking, perhaps moving on all fours, and so on. In some cases, it may be that the children were in fact developmentally challenged to begin with, but probably that has not always been the case. Studying this phenomenon experimentally is not really an option, so we have to settle for the case studies we have and the theoretical frameworks that fit with that evidence. It seems that in order for a child to develop into an adult with normal intelligence, personality, and other emotional and cognitive abilities, and the language those capabilities require, socialization with other humans at an early age is necessary. A sensitive period is a phase when we are particularly effective at learning a skill, but it is not the only time we can learn it. For example, we are very good at picking up new languages before we turn 16, but we can still learn them later, even if it takes a bit more effort then. At least I certainly hope so, because I do spend quite a bit of my time trying to learn a new language, mostly using a famous mobile phone app. But seriously, even if learning a language may have been easier when I was young, I still find it enjoyable to practice that, probably more so than I did when I was young. Motivation is key to learning, regardless of age. But the sensitive period for most learning seems to be when you're young, which is why we try to provide everyone a good general education when they are at their most receptive. Here's a good example of the sensitive period. Babies are equally good at distinguishing the sounds of all languages at 6 to 8 months of age. Afterwards, this changes as the baby begins to improve in the language of their main caregivers, while losing the ability to learn the weird sounds of other languages. Patricia Kuhl's team experimented on babies about 9 months old from English-speaking families in the US. A Chinese-speaking person played with them and read to them from a picture book about 12 times for 25 minutes each time, over a period of about a month. Afterwards, these babies were able to distinguish Chinese sounds almost as well as Taiwanese babies exposed to Chinese all the time at home. The point is that these babies, unlike those in a control group, did not lose the ability to distinguish Chinese sounds because of this small amount of exposure. Experiments have also shown that this only happens when the babies are exposed to real interaction with a person, not when they are just passively watching Chinese programs on TV, for example. Developmental psychologists have studied the effects of various environmental factors on human development. For example, the physical environment includes things like buildings, yards, pathogens, nourishment, various toxins, technology, and the climate. Relationships with other humans are also environmental factors. These other people can include at least one's parents, siblings, teachers, peers, members of the extended family, and acquaintances. Even the broadly defined culture involves many environmental factors like values, norms, ideals, structure of society, economic factors, religions, and other ideologies. Different kinds of combinations of environmental factors can have widely ranging influences on those affected by them and their psychological development. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, excuse my pronunciation of that name, worked on the environmental influences on human development and created a rather complex model about it. See image. He saw our biology as providing us the potential for development, but various environmental effects then have a lot of influence on how and into what we do develop. The main point of this model is that there are environmental factors very close to the individual called the microsystem, which include the family, peers, school, and other people and things the individual interacts with. Far more abstract and distant is the macro system, meaning the attitudes, ideologies, values, common understanding of history and such things that indirectly influence the individual. Between these extremes are the meso and exo systems, things like mass media, politics, as well as people the individual is not directly interacting with. For example, a child is clearly influenced by their parents, but the way those parents interact with their child are influenced by cultural norms, perhaps the atmosphere at their workplace, which might cause the parents stress, for example, and even laws about things like maternity leave or working hours and so on. The Matthew effect, named after a phrase in the Bible according to which to everyone who has will more be given and he will have abundance, but from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This pretty horrible idea unfortunately seems to be true, in that at least some things seem to get inherited, causing those who are already well off to gain more good things, while those who start worse off also accumulate more bad things. For example, a high level of education seems to be inherited even in a rather egalitarian country like Finland, and so does alcoholism. These both can influence employment, mental health, and other such things. Good factors tend to pile up for some, while bad factors tend to pile up for others. Developmental psychology is not the only field of science interested in human development. While that branch of science studies psychological phenomena like the development of personality, motivation, or psychosocial development, or the development of language throughout human life, other branches may be more focused on specific things. For example, anatomy and physiology study the development of the body, especially the nervous system. This is of course of great importance to psychology as well. So these sciences can benefit from each other. Sociology, on the other hand, is interested in how children join society and how people interact with the rest of society. Again, highly relevant to developmental psychology. Education, as a field of study, is mainly focused on children and learning, different stages of development, and how they are connected to learning. This is obviously of great interest to developmental psychologists as well. All these fields also share an interest in twin studies, because this type of study provides valuable evidence about the biological basis of our development. Such studies are especially informative because identical twins share almost exactly the same DNA. But due to various reasons, a lot of twins have been separated as children and brought up in different families, so in different environments. At least one reason for this was that it was thought that the identical twins would not develop well with a mirror image of themselves growing up alongside them. This is nonsense, but the fact that twins were raised not even knowing about each other makes it possible to study how much biological genetic inheritance influences human development. The DNA for the twins, after all, was nearly identical, and only the environment was markedly different, so any differences between the twins seem to be attributable to environmental influences. This makes it possible to conduct statistical studies where the variation between certain characteristics, such as personality traits, intelligence, or height, among the test subjects can be calculated and the role played by genetics thus statistically assessed. I have already explained how science works in my series and book Introduction to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, and how psychology fits within the sciences in my series and book Introduction to Psychology. So I won't discuss the basics during this series. I will instead use examples of scientific studies and the discoveries they have made. For example, when studying babies who obviously do not speak and so cannot answer questions, psychologists observe their behavior instead. There are different ways of doing this. One is the preference technique, where the babies are shown two images or objects, and the researchers measure how much time the baby spends looking at each of them. The same is repeated with many babies, and if most of them show similar preference in looking at one of them, this tells us something. Another method is to use the phenomena of habituation and dishabituation. The first means getting used to stimulus, which the researchers achieve by subjecting the baby to the same stimulus until the baby no longer shows interest in it. Then the baby is given a similar but slightly different stimulus. If the baby shows renewed interest in it, dishabituation, this means that the baby is able to perceive the difference. Again, this test can be used to reveal something about the development of babies. To test if babies and toddlers perceive the world like adults do, they have been put into interesting situations with visual cues to test their depth perception, for example. Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk devised a visual cliff test, where a table with a clear checkerboard pattern was covered by a clear glass. The glass covering extended beyond the table, as did the pattern, so that it looks like there's a cliff past the table. The glass is actually at the same level of the whole thing, but the idea is that a baby may not notice the transparent glass. The baby is placed on the high end on top of the visual hill, and its mother calls for it from the other end. 6-month-old babies would not crawl over the edge of the cliff because they have depth perception and so recognize the cliff and want to avoid falling. Younger babies don't understand the visual clues and so happily crawl to their mother. Perception is also studied by tracking the subject's eye movements to see how they scan images of faces, objects, and so on. This can be used to demonstrate differences between what children of different ages pay attention to. Going forward, I will give more examples of studies relevant to the developmental phenomena being discussed. Ethics is relevant to all fields of science, but because developmental psychology deals with and studies children and in some cases also people who are in some way cognitively impaired, ethical issues may be a bit more important in this field than they are in science on average. Human rights and the rights of children, as expressed by the UN, are the basis for ethical thinking here. Children and others who have limited competence or are incompetent in the legal sense are especially vulnerable and therefore have to be treated with special care. All research subjects must, of course, give informed consent, But in some cases, as with babies, this is impossible, and it is almost always the parents or other legal guardians who must give the consent. Even then, it is important to make sure that consent is properly informed and that the subjects understand that they can stop participating in the research at any time. It is also important for reasons of a wider scale that the researchers make participation in scientific research a positive experience for the subjects, because that affects the attitudes of the people in general toward science as well. The more people start disliking science, the more difficult it will be to conduct studies. This point, in my experience, tends to get forgotten or overlooked when ethics of science is discussed. Also, because children are often the subjects of developmental psychology, the researchers are more likely to come across signs of mistreatment or abuse than in most other fields. They should be aware of this possibility, perhaps be ready to notice such things and to contact Child Protective Services without delay, even if that causes difficulties for their own research. Psychologists must start thinking about the ethical questions relevant to their research already when they begin planning said research. Ethical thinking should then accompany scientific thinking throughout the project. All research on humans and other animals requires a permit from an ethical board before one is allowed to proceed with it. Universities and major hospitals have formed such boards. The basic ethical requirements in developmental psychology are the same as in science always. It must be open and public, neutral and independent of outside influences, and research must aim at generalizable results. It is also important to assess the effects of research on the subjects and what influences the research may have even more broadly. It is important for all the results to be published, regardless of what the results are, even if they fail to show what the researchers were hoping for. A null result is also an important result, and not publishing those causes what is known as the file drawer problem, which will skew meta-analyses, which are trying to form an overview of all the relevant research on a specific topic. It is important to get all the results published so that the replicability of the alleged phenomenon can be assessed. A scientific publication must properly cite the sources used, and plagiarizing the works of others is, of course, unacceptable. Copyrights regarding the publication generally belong to the researchers themselves. For developmental psychology, the importance of respecting the privacy of the subjects is unusually important, again because children are involved. For example, research may involve taking photographs or recording video of children who may not even be clothed, and the subject might, once grown up, wish not to have such images displayed. To protect the anonymity of the subject, it is important that the information and data collected be kept secure after the research project is finished and stored in such a way that if another researcher wishes to work on the same materials, they have to apply for the same permits as the original researcher. This storage is usually made available by universities or other relevant institutions, such as certain archives. Some of the important ethical questions, really for any scientist, include at least the following. Who will benefit from the research? Who is funding the research and why? whose efforts in the research project will be compensated and whose will not. What can be done with the knowledge generated if it is eventually made public? There are also heavy ethical issues with research using animal tests. I have discussed those previously in my series and book on philosophical ethics. So if you are interested in ethics, I suggest you check it out. See the links below. If you're still watching, you should now have some idea of what developmental psychology is all about. Thanks for watching. In the following several episodes, I will be discussing various aspects of development, starting with physical development. I hope to see you back on my channel then. Bye for now. If you wish to support my channel, please click thumbs up, subscribe and share my videos. Any comments on the videos would also be welcome.